Hi, folks. Welcome back. And buckle up because America is in that special phase where the people who can't define a woman are now trying to define masculinity. See, in this brave new era of TikTok tantrums and DEI presidential candidates, the Democrat Party has decided their next big strategy is to send a morbidly obese activist to lecture young men about what makes them tick. Because nothing screams alpha male appeal like a DNC influencer who thinks every Republican is secretly marching for BLM and camo Crocs. Today's clips are a perfect snapshot of the cultural psychosis the left is currently experiencing, where the idea of outreach to men involves shaming them, gaslighting them, and then wondering why they'd rather deadlift than vote blue. Let's dig into this delusion.
The reason why Republican messaging resonates with men is because men want bad things, right? So men want to have sex and own women, right? They want to dominate everybody. And Republicans say, you get to do that. And then Democrats can't say that. So we just lost men. It's over, right? What are you talking about? A lot of times it will be men that are liberals who will agree with that shit. I'm like, dude, what is going on? There's a lot of men that don't think that way, obviously. And it's just such a negative view to take on half of the human race.
Well, I also think it's just so abundantly clear that the people who say these things don't actually spend time talking to young men.
Oh, yeah?
You know this because we know each other in real life, but I spend a lot of time on college campuses.
Oh, do you?
And I spend a lot of time with
young men.
I love young men. I love frat guys. And in that, I've realized, even the ones that identify as conservative are almost always pro-choice. They're almost always pro-gay marriage. You'd be surprised at the number of them who supported Black Lives Matter.
Huh.
And so I feel like people just kind of lump them into this box when the truth is, again, a lot of them are with us on the issues. They're just not part of our coalition because they feel like they're not welcomed in it.
I'm so glad men have twinkle toes over here to tell us exactly who we are and what we prioritize, because what man doesn't love it when a strange woman defines you with zero input, just conjures a caricature from the ether and parades it around like gospel to push her political agenda. According to Olivia Juliana, the left's new ambassador to the male psyche, conservative men are actually liberal. They just don't know it yet. They're pro-choice, pro-gay marriage, pro-BLM. They're just confused frat bros who haven't gotten the invite to the coalition cookout yet. Apparently, the problem isn't Democrat messaging. It's just the vibes. Now, let's be clear. This isn't just cringe. It's a window into the left's broader delusion that you can redefine someone's identity for them and then get offended when they don't sign on to it. The modern progressive project isn't about persuasion anymore. It's about coercive inclusion. You don't meet people where they are. You inform them where they're supposed to be instead. But if they resist, you pathologize them as hateful, brainwashed, or, as we heard from the Gen Z activists, just fundamentally bad. According to him, Republican men are motivated by a desire to own women and dominate everybody, and Democrats lose because they don't cater to that. That's not analysis, by the way. It's projection wrapped in weird superiority complex. And ironically, it's the exact reason why so many men are walking away from the left in the first place. What we're witnessing here is a slow motion collapse of a worldview that cannot accept any deviation from its given script. The Democrat coalition has become so obsessed with identity politics, so committed to emotional blackmail, that it no longer sees individuals, it sees demographics. And when young men, particularly white or straight ones, don't fit the mold, the instinct isn't curiosity, it's straight up condemnation. These aren't just rhetorical missteps. They're the cultural outworkings of an ideology that's allergic to accountability. The failure to reach men is framed not as a weakness in Democrat messaging, but as a moral failing in men themselves. They're either bad or they're secret allies who just need to be educated into enlightenment and pushed hard enough over the cliff. Now, let's be honest. It's not just about young men. It's about control. This is the same political movement that shamed boys for being too aggressive, mocked fathers as toxic relics, and pushed classroom curriculums that treat masculinity like a disease. And now they're confused why their own Frankenstein won't come home for Thanksgiving. The institutions that once shaped men, faith, family, discipline, duty, have been systematically dismantled by the very cultural forces now begging to understand why men aren't thriving in the chaos they created. So no, Olivia, it's not that young men secretly agree with you. It's that you and your party have spent the better part of a decade telling them they are the problem. And now you're shocked they're not volunteering to be part of the solution. This isn't about outreach. It's about power, plain and simple. And for once, Men are saying, no thanks. Good for men. And speaking of Democrats choice planning, there's been a lot of conversation around Trump cutting funding for the leftist propaganda machine known as NPR, National Public Radio. And let's just say that they're not taking it well.
Yeah, I've not seen anything like this in my adult lifetime. I think we're looking at a comprehensive attack on free speech that is maybe most reminiscent of the Red Scare. And, you know, the one thing that is so particularly pernicious about it is that Donald Trump is very shrewd, politically shrewd in his attack. He's taking on a lot of institutions that a lot of Americans don't like. So, for example, elite universities. You're not exactly going to get millions of Americans in the streets for elite universities. Or white shoe law firms. People are going to be in the streets for white shoe law firms. Or for big media outlets where he sued them for defamation, et cetera, or retaliated against them. So he's choosing many of these politically unpopular targets, but that's the classic move of the censors. If you go back to the Red Scare, this was a frontal attack on free speech aimed at some of the least popular speech in America. This is how authoritarianism begins. It begins not by taking on the popular voices. It begins by taking on the unpopular voices. And I'm not saying that NPR doesn't have millions of listeners, and there aren't many people who love Harvard, but these institutions are very much in the crosshairs of Trump's base. So he's playing to his base here, which makes it politically sustainable, even while it's a direct attack on the Constitution. And its political popularity, at least amongst his base, is what makes this so dangerous. He has a lot of the public wind at his back when he's doing it, and then he's turning around and vilifying the judges who are standing up against him. And so he's creating a very, very dangerous dynamic here.
Democrats want you to believe that defunding NPR is a second coming of McCarthyism, not a simple budget decision, but the start of an authoritarian crackdown on free speech. And yet, this panic comes on the heels of a Democrat administration that actively pressured social media companies to silence dissent. The Facebook and Twitter censorship files laid it all out in black and white for everybody to see. Still, they insist the real threat is Donald Trump pulling taxpayer money from a failing hyper-partisan media outlet. The irony is thick enough to bottle. Now, let's get one thing straight. NPR isn't some neutral bastion of free inquiry. It's an ideological mouthpiece that long ago traded journalism for narrative curation. When they're not platforming race essentialism or running puff pieces on teenage hormone blockers, they're ignoring stories that challenge their worldview, stories that happen to matter for millions of Americans. So when Trump cuts off their funding, it's not an attack on the First Amendment. It's cutting back on federal subsidies for activism dressed up as reporting. But this MSDNC's hysterics are actually revealing the institutions he's trying to protect. The legacy media, elite universities, coastal law firms are the very ones that have spent the last decade enforcing a rigid orthodoxy in public discourse. They pushed DEI mandates, canceled dissenters, and normalized the idea that words are violence, unless, of course, those words are directed at conservatives. And when they lose cultural power, when Americans finally push back through democratic means, suddenly that's authoritarianism. Now, to be absolutely clear, we're not witnessing a Red Scare. It's a slow and long overdue correction. For years, the left consolidated control of media, academia, entertainment, and tech, believing they had a divine mandate to engineer the public mind. But now that grip is slipping. NPR's funding isn't guaranteed, neither is Harvard's, and their prestige is cracking under the weight of their own hypocrisy. Even big tech, once the crown jewel of liberal hegemony, has been constantly exposed in court filings that show direct coordination with Biden's White House to silence political speech during COVID and the 2020 election cycle. Remember the Facebook case? Emails from Biden officials demanding content takedowns, flagging accounts, pressuring platforms to remove misinformation, which of course meant anything that challenged the Democrat-approved narrative. Where was David French then? Probably busy writing another piece about the dangers of Trumpism. The truth is, the people screaming the loudest about free speech right now are the ones who abused it when they had the keys. They built an empire of curated truth and called it science. They declared debate a threat and censorship a virtue. And now that they're on the defensive, they want to cry foul and invoke the Constitution they spent years undermining and actually trying to destroy. Oh, and the discontent with Trump's policies goes all the way up the chain to the head of NPR, who is also not very happy Of course.
So how precisely does President Trump's executive order against NPR and PBS violate the First Amendment? What's the case that you're making against the Trump White House?
Well, it's interesting because the executive order is very specific in that it accuses NPR and PBS of not airing fair or unbiased news. And so it is a textbook example of viewpoint discrimination from a First Amendment standpoint. Essentially, by blocking funding to NPR and PBS, it is a form of retaliation against our organizations for airing editorial programming that the president might disagree with. We're a nonpartisan news organization. We seek to be able to provide a range of different viewpoints in terms of who we bring on air, the stories that we tell. We're buttressed in this effort by the fact that we have 200 local newsrooms across the country. So a significant portion of the reporting that you hear on NPR is not coming out of D.C., it's coming out of smaller stations in rural area. 20% of Americans today do not have access to a local newspaper or a source of news other than public media. We take federal dollars very seriously, and we seek to maximize them by raising additional funds from private philanthropies, from individual viewers and listeners. That's tremendously important to that promise that we have. But it is also the case that without federal funding, we would not have the universal access that public media affords today. We are free in every household in the nation, or 99.7%, which rounds up to 100%. That is something that nobody else offers, and we view that as a critical part of a functioning democracy for people to have access to news, information, educational, and cultural programming. That's why.
Now, Catherine Marr wants you to believe that Trump's decision to defund the network is some kind of First Amendment violation. A textbook case of viewpoint discrimination. According to her, pulling taxpayer dollars from NPR isn't a budget decision, it's political retaliation. But let's be clear, this isn't about free speech. This is about taxpayer-funded speech, and there's a big difference. The First Amendment prevents the government from punishing individuals for their speech, not from choosing where your tax dollars go. No one at NPR is being arrested, fined, or silenced. They're just being told they'll have to survive without the forced charity of Americans who no longer believe they're getting journalism in return from NPR. That's not censorship, that's accountability. And when Marr says NPR is a nonpartisan news organization, that's laughable. She's not even making a legal argument. She's performing for a shrinking elitist audience that still believes neutrality can be declared by fiat, even when the content completely betrays it. And let's talk about what NPR has become. This is the same outlet that refused to cover the Hunter Biden laptop story in 2020 because, in their words, they didn't want to waste the audience's time. The same network that promoted debunked Russia collusion narratives for years, platformed race essentialist ideology as science, and handed airtime to activists masquerading as experts, all while dismissing legitimate concerns from half the country as misinformation or conspiracy. So when Marr talks about editorial programming the president might disagree with, what she really means is a multi-year record of editorial bias so obvious it's laughable to even try to call it news. And yet this is precisely what the institutional left has built, a network of taxpayer-supported entities that present their worldview as objective truth and label anything outside of it as a threat to democracy. When they talk about universal access, they're really talking about cultural dominance. When they say they represent rural areas, they mean they're proud to beam beltway narratives into places that didn't ask for them. And when they claim their funding is essential to public education, what they're really saying is their ideology deserves public subsidy. Yours and mine, whether we agree with it or not. But here's a bigger picture. The left is panicking because they thought they had secured the high ground forever. They spent decades embedding their worldview into universities, media, bureaucracies, and tech platforms, assuming it would never be challenged. Now, as their monopoly fractures, they're lashing out, claiming that every loss of power is a constitutional crisis. But the truth is, Trump's executive order is not the beginning of authoritarianism. It's a long overdue course correction. The public is no longer buying the lie that partisan institutions are neutral just because those same institutions claim they are. And everybody with a right mind can see they're not. So defunding NPR doesn't silence them. It simply says, if you want to keep preaching, do it on your own dime. Welcome to the free market, baby. Oh, and speaking of leftist institutional decay, this one is going to blow your mind.
I thought that it was important that, especially in criminal cases, where when you have people that on one side of the bench, they can look at the judge and say, wow, she looks like me, then maybe I have a better shot.
Come again, what was that? Are leftists just saying the quiet part out loud all the time now? Or did a sitting judge just suggest that justice is more legitimate when the judge looks like the criminal? That's not just a slip of the tongue. It's the full confession of an ideology that's been eating away at the legal system for years. Judge Williams didn't just say the mask off part. She threw the mask in the shredder and said, now this is equity. And let's be clear, this isn't about empathy or inclusion or fairness. It's about injecting identity into the very heart of justice, replacing objectivity with optics. If the role of a judge is no longer to uphold the law impartially, but to reflect the perceived identity of the defendant, we are no longer operating within a justice system. We're operating within a tribal grievance tribunal. And in this case, Judge Williams, who it's worth noting, downgraded charges on a repeat offender who violently attacked random white people, has openly admitted that race and familiarity are the lens through which she dispenses justice. Isn't that amazing? If that doesn't terrify you, I don't know what will, because what happens when the standard isn't guilt or innocence, but cultural solidarity? What happens when a victim's rights come second to a judge's personal narrative based on race? And what message does it send when, in her own words, this judge's own words, justice is only real if the judge physically resembles the defendant? That's not progress. That's the death of blind justice. But this didn't come out of nowhere. This is the fruit of years of critical race theory and lived experience replacing merit in our institutions. The law schools now teach that the justice system is inherently racist. Corporate DEI programs reward identity over performance. And judges are increasingly chosen not for their constitutional fidelity, but for their demographic symbolism. So it's not just the system is broken, it's that it's being re-engineered from within to reflect ideology and not law. And here's a deeper irony. The worldview doesn't actually uplift anyone. It corrodes trust across the board. If people start believing that the outcome of their trial depends on the skin color of the judge, or that certain crimes are treated differently depending on who committed them, we've abandoned the very idea of equal protection under the law. We don't get justice. We get resentment, chaos, and a fractured public square. By the way, what the judge is showing here isn't compassionate in any sense of the word. It's dangerous. And it's no coincidence that the same judge preaching identity-based justice has a son in jail for homicide. When personal dysfunction seeps into institutional philosophy, everyone suffers. The victims, the rule of law, and yes, even the defendants who deserve real due process, not performative bias. In the end, a judge isn't supposed to look like a criminal. The judge is supposed to look like justice, blind, impartial, and bound to the law. We don't need courtroom mirrors. We need courtroom standards. Meanwhile, over in Michelle Obama world, what is she complaining about now?
There was a line of people waiting to shake hands with our respective husbands, you know, people like reaching over our heads and spilling water on us, trying to get to these two, you know, illustrious men, you know, and she had the same look on her face as I did. Like, here we go, you know, and I looked over at this beautiful woman. Did we even have a conversation? Not until later in that afternoon. And that
so you hadn't met?
We hadn't met.
You just
this
saw
was, you know,
each
kind of
other
sad.
at the
I just
table.
saw the look on her face, which expressed the sentiments that I felt, which was
pissed off.
Ah, yes, Michelle Obama, ever the voice of elite victimhood, wants you to know just how hard it is being married to one of the most powerful and adored men in modern history. How frustrating it is when the peasants line up to shake your husband's hand and not yours, because nothing says oppression like being mildly inconvenienced at a social function. This isn't about a tone-deaf anecdote. It's a revealing glimpse into a modern aristocracy that's addicted to grievance. Now, I think it's clear to everyone that what Michelle is describing isn't injustice. It's just pure ego. And it's the same kind of ego that now defines a whole generation of liberal elites. The expectation that admiration is not only deserved, but required. That equality means equal adoration, equal spotlight, equal reverence, regardless of role, responsibility, or actual achievement. And when reality doesn't conform to that script, the default response is resentment. But here's a deeper point. This mindset isn't just personal, it's cultural. We live in a time when hierarchy is seen as inherently oppressive, even when it's earned. when being next to greatness rather than being the center of it is framed as a slight. That's why you see legacy media and academia churning out endless think pieces on emotional labor, gender dynamics, and the invisible toll of traditional roles, even in families that are objectively thriving. It's grievance as status, bitterness as empowerment, and the ego, the self, at the center of the universe rather than God. And what's so telling is that this narrative is coming from someone who is given every institutional advantage, Princeton, Harvard Law, First Lady of the United States, and still manages to frame herself as overlooked. It's a perfect example of what happens when prestige is no longer enough, when even the top 1% needs to feel morally aggrieved to justify their relevance in a culture that worships victimhood. And look, this isn't to say that women shouldn't be recognized or valued in their own right. Of course they should. But recognition isn't something that's owed. It's earned. It's merit-based. And when the highest profile women in the country start publicly resenting the attention their own husbands receive for decades of public service, it signals something deeper, a culture that's forgotten how to be secure in one's role without needing to be the main character in every single room they step in. So no, this isn't just about Michelle's ranting. It's a symptom of a larger rot, a cultural obsession with status, resentment of male success, and an unwillingness to celebrate complementary strength. It's why feminism today feels less like empowerment and more like rivalry. And if we want to build a culture that values family, purpose, and cooperation, we have to start by rejecting the idea that someone else's applause is somehow your oppression. So ask yourself, what kind of culture are we building when even the most privileged among us posture as the overlooked? When admiration is treated as a zero-sum game and victimhood becomes the ultimate currency of credibility? At what point does self-pity from the powerful stop being relatable and start being corrosive? This is much bigger than Michelle Obama. It's a reflection of a society that no longer knows how to honor strength without apology or difference without resentment. If we keep accepting every complaint from the elite as a moral truth, what happens to our ability to discern real injustice from wounded ego? You don't have to buy what they're selling. You just have to start asking who profits when you do. Anyway, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Have a terrific day. Peace.